Flash flooding has been the big national weather story of the week, with historic flooding and rising river levels in central Texas and the Guadalupe River Valley. Meteorologist John Burchfield here with this week's edition of the Climate Friday newsletter. Now, even if you're not personally affected by the flooding that has occurred in Texas, you may be wondering, could something like this happen here at home? And also, how is climate change affecting flooding, and what can you expect in the future years and the future decades? I'm going to make sense of the data in this week's edition of the Climate Friday. I'm going to compare the flooding that occurs down in Texas to what Ohio and Michigan experiences, and also what does some of the data show that the future decades will have in store as far as flooding, both in terms of the personal and the financial impact. So we're going to be talking about the increasing risk of flooding, what we're currently seeing now, and also what scientists project for the future. Now, one of the biggest impacts of a warmer world on flooding is the fact that there is more moisture for evaporation and thus precipitation as well. Now, a 1-degree increase in temperatures, it might not sound like much. However, a 1-degree temperature increase can correspond to a 7% rise in water vapor, and that increase in water vapor can be used and held by the atmosphere and eventually wrung out like a washcloth in the form of precipitation. So 1-degree temperature increase corresponds to approximately a 7% increase in water vapor. And of course, when you compound that, a 2, 3, 4-degree increase, you can see a multiple-fold increase in the amount of water vapor that's available. So the mechanism by which climate change causes an increase in flooding is quite simple. Well, not only do we have hotter temperatures of the air in terms of the thermometers, but we have hotter oceans and warmer Great Lakes temperatures. A lot of that moisture comes from Lake Erie and from the Great Lakes here. And of course, down in Texas, the Gulf of Mexico, as well as oceanic waters are warmer. That fuels greater evaporation, and there's more moisture for rainfall, and all that moisture has to go somewhere. So heavier rainfall is often one of the side effects of a warmer world, and that's a direct correlation, and it's a correlation that is not only linear, but it can be exponential at times. As temperatures rise, as we go right on that scale, the amount of moisture increases, but it's not always a linear increase. It is really increasing at a rapid rate, and that fuels not only heavier rain, but it can even, in fact, fuel heavier snow events. Now, it's kind of a tricky relationship there, because we obviously have warmer temperatures as a whole. However, when it is cold enough to snow, we can see bigger snow events as a result of climate change. That's something we'll delve into when we approach that winter season. But now that we are in flash flood season in the heart of summer, I want to put some numbers to it and compare how flooding in Toledo has compared to other cities across the country. Now, data looking at rainfall rates, in other words, how hard the rain comes down over the last half century or so, shows a significant increase in rainfall rates in Toledo. Now, this data goes from 1970 to 2024, and in the Toledo metro, there has been a 28% rise in rainfall rates. Now, that is above the national average. I wanted to list a few of the cities that have been affected the greatest by climate change. Now, many of these cities you may think of as relatively dry places. Wichita, a 38% rise. Reno, Nevada, you may be thinking of that as the desert out west. However, they have seen a 37% rise in the rate of rainfall. Fairbanks, Alaska. Alaska's been affected significantly with a 37% rise. And of course, rainfall rates increasing could also be associated with heavier snow in the winter. El Paso, Texas. There's a Texas city that has seen a more significant increase. Bismarck and Tucson are other cities that have also seen a sharp rise in rainfall rates. So how does this impact compare from Toledo to some other Texas locations close to where the flooding occurred this week? The hourly rainfall rate over the last half century in Toledo has risen by 28%, and that is almost identical to what climate change has done to San Angelo, Texas, which is near the Guadalupe River Valley. So we've seen a similar rise in terms of rainfall rates. Of course, the geography and topography are a little flatter here at home, so that rainfall rate doesn't cause as dire of consequences. So how is the change in rainfall regionally compared to other regions across the country? Well, this data set goes back even further. We're looking at data since the 1950s, and since the 50s, the change in precip has been even greater. Changes in rainfall overall have been about a 60% increase in rainfall rate in New England, and across the Midwest, about a 45% increase in the intensity or the rate of the rainfall. Across the southeastern United States, it's been a little bit of a lesser impact. You may think of heavy thunderstorms across the Gulf Coast of the United States. Well, it hasn't been quite as big of a change there. Across portions of Texas and the Southwest, a 21% increase, and in the northern plains, a similar fold increase as well. And out towards the Desert West, a 17% increase. What about the Pacific Northwest? Relatively unchanged. That is one of the areas that has been affected the least. So some of the factors associated with climate change that may be associated with growing flooding. The plus sign equals more severe floods, and the minus sign equals less severe floods. Obviously, more intense rainfall, that is one of the most direct links to climate change, and that is something that is causing more significant flooding. Now, also drought is becoming more common, and this has sort of a multiple-fold effect on rainfall and flooding. On one hand, drought is obviously the opposite of flooding, but on the other hand, dry soil is not as effective at soaking up moisture, and as a result, when you have a drought followed by heavy downpours, that can exacerbate flooding. Similarly, less snow and an earlier melt, that leads to less flooding because there's less snow cover on the ground when you start off the spring season. However, when it does snow, we have more moisture in the atmosphere, and that can lead to heavier snowfall rates in addition to rainfall rates. There have been some very real financial implications to flooding as well, and flood loss across the Buckeye State is fairly significant at around $1 billion. Compare that to Michigan, a little less than $500 million, and in Texas, more significant flooding occurring at about $1.5 billion. Now, how do climate scientists expect this to change into the future? In Ohio, there is likely to be about a 4% increase in the financial burden of flooding by mid-century. That's by 2050. In Michigan, a little less at a 3% increase. Now, one of the most stark pieces of data that you'll notice is in Texas. That is expected to increase by 47% by the middle of the century. In other words, climate change is affecting those areas on the Gulf Coast where there is more moisture far more substantially. And the financial burden of flooding in Texas is already $500 million bigger than it is in Ohio, and that is expected to grow into the future. The current and future flood loss, this is the estimated average annual flood loss in Ohio, is around $1 billion. And you can see Lucas County is shaded in red there. That is one of the counties that is affected the most. Across Michigan, it's a little bit less of a financial burden with a 3% rise expected by the mid-century. And in Texas, $1.5 billion in annual flooding. And you'll notice much of that is in central Texas, where there are those river levels that can spike with flash flooding, and also along the Gulf Coast, where there are expected to be some significant changes as a result of the burden of flooding. Of course, this flooding concern is the big national story this week, but as summer continues to unfold, we'll be talking about the heat and other summer impacts. Subscribe to that Climate Friday newsletter at WTOL.com/email, and we'll see you in next week's edition.